Nós estamos muito felizes de receber o Dr. Andreoni, né, que é da University College London. E para enriquecer ainda mais a nossa discussão, a gente conta com a presença do Dr. Carlos Gadelha, que é coordenador das ações de prospecção da Fiocruz, que vai debater um pouco a palestra do Andreoni, e a doutora Claudia Chamas também, que é professora do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Políticas Públicas, Estratégia e Desenvolvimento do Estudo de Economia da UFRJ e também colaboradora lá do CDTS. Eu queria só esclarecer algumas questões técnicas. Então, o seminário vai ser ministrado em inglês pelo Dr. Andreoni, né? E isso não quer dizer que as perguntas precisam ser feitas em inglês. Então, as perguntas serão feitas via chat. Para as pessoas que estão no streaming ao vivo, também tem um boxzinho de perguntas. Elas podem ser feitas em português ou em inglês. A gente faz a tradução sem problema nenhum. É importante que todos os microfones fiquem desligados, a não ser os microfones do palestrante, né, para a gente evitar os ruídos de comunicação, e os vídeos também. Então, assim que a gente começar, eu vou desligar meu vídeo, todos desligam e depois a gente religa na hora do debate. É bom lembrar que a cobertura desse seminário vai estar disponível amanhã no website do CDTS, então é uma coisa legal, assim, quem não pôde acompanhar, pode avisar para os amigos que essa cobertura vai estar disponível amanhã. Então, acho que já disse tudo. Queria agradecer a presença de todos hoje aqui e passo a palavra para a doutora Cláudia, então.
Thanks, Bruna. Good morning, everyone. Buongiorno, Andreoni. Welcome to today's webinar on challenges and opportunities for health innovation and industrial policy in a post-pandemic world. This webinar is one of the digital series organized by the Center for Technological Development in Health of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. Many analysts point out that the world is facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and it will be a long way back to the pre-crisis levels. Was the COVID-19 pandemic a surprise? In September 2019, 1 year ago, the World Health Organization's Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, that was chaired by Gro Brundtland, released its assessment of the world's preparedness for significant infectious disease outbreaks. The report, entitled A World at Risk, identified critical deficiencies in the world's readiness for epidemics, such as those that may be caused by novel respiratory pathogens, and called on global leaders to take urgent action to address these threats. The COVID-19 crisis is happening across the world, but in some countries with weaker health systems and limited technological capabilities, the effects of the pandemic are worse felt. Countries able to coordinate scientific and technological progress combined with strong manufacturing capabilities could better address complex challenges. As a recent paper written by Mariana Mazzucato and Els Torrielli highlighted, to ensure that no one is left behind requires not just unprecedented collective investment, but also different approach. Massive efforts depend on substantial public investment and a mission-oriented approach. To discuss these issues and other complementary issues, we have today two authorities. They are Professor Antonio Andreoni and Professor Carlos Gadelha. I'm sure they are very well known to many of you already. Bruna already gave the announcement of how to raise comments and make interventions, so please do that along the presentation. So without further ado, I would like to say that it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Andreoni. But for that, I would like to say a big thank you to Marco Tulio, who made the contact between Fiocruz Foundation and the Institute for Innovation for Purpose, and put us in touch with Professor Andreoni. It's really a great pleasure, a great honor to have you here. Antonio Andreoni is Associate Professor of Industrial Economics at University College London, UCL, and Head of Research of UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. He is also visiting Associate Professor in the Fourth Industrial Revolution at South African Research Chairs Initiative, University of Johannesburg. Antonio has researched and published extensively on production, technology, and innovation dynamics, and governance and industrial policy. He was senior consultant for several organizations, including the World Bank and OECD. Antonio holds a PhD from Cambridge University. Antonio, the screen is yours.
Claudia, thanks so much. Thanks so much for the very generous introduction. And it's absolutely my honor to be here with you virtually. I have the chance to discuss with you about such an important topic, and especially with the community of scholars, scientists who are part of an institutions and a center at Fiocruz, which has a well-known history and a well-known model that many of us have been looking at over the years. So I'm particularly pleased, and I want to thank as well Marco for having made this link, and for everyone to be today with us to participate in this discussion. So when I was asked to give a talk about some of the issues that are emerging in the context of health innovation and the role the state can play in a post-pandemic world to move towards a new, different type of normal, we discussed to engage with this issue of how industrial policy specifically can play a role in actually sizing the opportunities that health innovation offer to all countries, independently from their level of development. So what I will try to do is to discuss some of these issues, also building on some experiences that I've been looking at over the last months, which in a sense provides some laboratory to test some of the ideas and also try to identify what are the ingredients that have made certain countries, regions, institutions more capable to respond to the unprecedented challenges posed by the pandemic. And I will try to use some of these examples also to prepare the ground for a discussion on industrial policy and why is that the state can play a very important role through all its different institutions, government articulations in this space. Now, I don't need to, let's see if the slides works. Yes. I don't need to spend too much time in giving some idea of how deep the crisis we are talking about is. People have talked about the so-called Great Lockdown. The figures that have been presented shows the deepest global economic recession in modern history, in peacetime modern history, and double-digit recessions, contraction in GDP across a number of countries. And many of these are these estimations, these analysis are updated constantly, and the update don't seem to actually provide such encouraging results, despite many talking about different L shape or whatever type of recovery of the economy. And what I think is even more evident is the fact that the persistent level of uncertainty makes very difficult for governments and the economies as a whole to start reorganizing their main productive activities. Another important aspect is that clearly the crisis, as all crises, tend to have a disproportional impact, both within and across countries. And I will come back to this point because I think one of the key features of this crisis is how much heterogeneity, how much differences we observe, even within the same countries in terms of how they are dealing and how they are responding economically to the crisis. But what is clear is that independently from this disproportional impact and that therefore the different type of challenges that countries and regions are facing, in all these places, the crisis is doomed to have a long-lasting structural impact. When we compare the structural break that in the data, in many different type of parameters that the financial crisis had less than 10 years, 12 years ago, actually we see that the structural break that we will see in the data in the coming months and years is much more significant. One of the areas I will look at in particular, exactly because I'm interested in trying to articulate an argument for industrial policy in new opportunities and types of industrial policy in the post-pandemic. An important feature is the way in which the crisis is impacting global production and trade. In a recent article in the Financial Times, they were presenting some of these projections, and they were showing how even under the more optimistic scenarios, the type of, and these are the type of shape of recovery that you can see in green, blue, red, and so on, we are talking about a quite significant drop. And this drop, of course, is driven by the major players in the global production networks. On the right, if you look at how China export only in the first months of this year, how they've been dropping in specific manufacturing sector and in specific tradable commodities in relation to selected countries in the broader world, shows that something dramatic is happening at the level of the way in which production is organized and trade patterns will potentially develop in the coming months and years. Now, why I'm focusing on this issue? Because while all the key figures around GDP contraction and so on are important, these data on the change in the global production networks suggests a fundamental qualitative change, structural change in the way in which the global economy in countries might work. First of all, people have realized even more, if it was necessary, how interdependent economies are, and in some cases even how over-dependent they are in terms of their capacity to respond to specific shocks, both in terms of supply, but also in terms of government resources. And the interdependence has been made even more strong and manifested through the fact that global value chains are key transmission channels of economic contagion. And in a sense, they are the platform that has allowed, also facilitated the spread of not just the spread of the pandemic per se, but the spread of the economic impact of the crisis. In some cases, some economists and commentators like Martin Wolf have already mentioned that there is a looming war on supply chains, and mentioning the risk that a more protectionist industrial policy approach and trade policy approach will start dominating across a number of countries. In reality, while of course the war on supply chain is something that should worry us. At the same time, we need to realize how any crisis, and in particular this crisis, has the potential to both create new opportunities as well as challenges and problems. In particular, it is quite clear, and I will come back to these issues later on, that the COVID has an impact on the length of the supply chains, but also the polarity of these chains. So who is actually controlling the organization of production and controlling the technologies that are used along these value chains. In some cases, some patterns of regional concentration and consolidation of the supply chains were happening before already the COVID crisis. If you think about sectors like automotive, were already in a quite important reconfiguration. But in other areas, we can also see that a crisis like the one that we are experiencing now can raise new opportunities towards more localization of some supply chain and, in some cases, reshoring of some activities. Now, in looking at all this situation, there are several contributing factors that are making the analysis more complex than usual. And the fact that COVID emerged in a very specific moment, in a moment where there was a sort of crisis of the so-called world liberal order. The conflict, the geopolitical conflict between major players were already reshaping the way in which global production and also the technological race in digitalization and digital platform and data was already in place. And at the same time, the COVID crisis has been intersecting many other crises in terms of years of austerity for many countries since the financial crisis in terms of the environmental transition and the need for addressing climate change, and many other crises in terms of also of increasing disparities and inequalities. In general, crises we know that operate as accelerators of structural problems. So in some cases, often new ones, of course, but what we see is that this acceleration raised the bar of the challenge in terms of governing a response. And of course, as a result of all this, we are from many angles talking about the importance of not going back to the normal, but actually to explore new configuration and new solutions, new innovative solutions to the crisis. Now, if this is the context in which we are operating, it's a context where dramatic changes are happening, there are all these overlapping crises that are mounting and that makes it difficult to navigate and identify a sort of pathway beyond the crisis. At the same time, the crisis has offered a number of opportunities to reflect on what should be the direction that should be given to the economic systems. And here I would like to raise a couple of points, one related to the way in which the crisis has revealed something very profound about differences in economic systems based on the economic responses that these systems have given. And secondly, how also is revealed something very specific about the readiness that governments have in addressing systemic issues in an increasingly complex and interdependent economic system. Now, if I start with the issues around the, if you want, the way in which the pandemic has revealed new information about our economic system, we have seen how, and I could spend more time looking at the data. The data are still patchy because we are still observing something that is unfolding while we speak. But we have seen how economies have shown very different degrees of robustness. So they have different ability to maintain productive activities during the crisis. And this is extremely important, of course, in particular for businesses. When productive organizations stop to operate for a certain period of time, restarting is extremely challenging. But at the same time has shown different degrees of resilience. So the capacity to restart after a period of crisis also being different. And what is more interesting for me is also different degrees of readiness. For people who are involved in and study innovation processes and manufacturing system, know that we are in developing technologies, the readiness to scale up a new technology from the invention to the innovation, the commercialization, and not only scaling up the technology, but scaling up the manufacturing system that has to support a certain type of technology is a key parameter to assess the quality of an ecosystem or innovation system. And what we have seen is that the challenge that COVID has posed in terms of new solutions or even old traditional solutions like technologies like ventilator or apparently basic, quite relatively basic technologies in the context of PPE, protective equipment, masks, and so on, we have seen that actually a number of countries were not ready at all in responding to this type of crisis. And the reason why they were not ready was partially related to the robustness in the systems, the resilience, but also the capacity, and I will be back to this issue later on, to actually articulate innovative solutions in the health system and mobilize the health system in a way that was up to the standard and needs. We also realized that not all productive sectors are the same. Some are key, and who controls them matter in a time of crisis. Of course, for people, scholars who have been working on industrial policy issues, this is not a surprise that there is a dramatic heterogeneity in terms of sectors, in terms of how they contribute to the overall economic performances and economic readiness, resilience, and robustness. Ultimately, the bottom line is that we have realized that what you are capable to produce, but also where you produce, matter a lot. And this is something that cut across, as I said, both relatively high-tech health technologies like the ventilators, but also products that might be more basic in terms of their technological characteristics, mask, protective equipment, but they can be quite complex from the point of view of ramping up production and producing at scale under specific standard and specific quality condition. And of course, we have also realized, and this is what also Claudia was mentioning before, that increasingly who control these technologies matter a lot, and the current discussion on the vaccine and how countries are competing around that, it's central in this respect. The other wake-up moment, or the wake-up issue, is, as I said, related to the government response. And here I found extremely interesting to see how the different government capabilities were related, of course, to the institutional capability embedded in institutions like the health system, the national health system, or the research institution and infrastructures, but also how different government capabilities were manifested in coordinating the response across multi-level government institutions. So in other terms, it was not a matter of having capable institutions, but also the government itself, how much was still capable to manage these processes. And I'm emphasizing this issue because I'm looking at how, in particular, the UK have found extremely challenging to respond to the crisis, given the degree of, if you want, degradation of or decline in the government capabilities, the internal government capabilities that were required to actually respond to the crisis from the point of view of the testing, then the tracing and supply and so on of PPEs, and how the government had for a long time used actually to outsource lots of its function to management consultants and other institutions and organizations, which were proven to be not particularly successful and have not been proven to be particularly successful, especially in the UK case, in managing some of these issues. So there is a problem in terms of what institutions are there, what government capabilities exist, but also what is the model that the government has used over the years in terms of responding to its key functions in the health sector and broader economic system. Now, this issue has pointed to, I think, at least three important realizations. One is that too much static efficiency and too little dynamic efficiency and resilience is not a good idea. So in other terms, we have created economic systems both from the productive side and the government side that in the name of efficiency sometimes undermine the resilience and the capacity to have that extra backup capacity that is required to address uncertainty or fast evolving scenarios. And this has been partially embedded in the way in which public management and governance is understood, and also the way in which companies themselves operate in structuring their supply chains and their way of making investment. And also, we have realized that weak government structures, so not just the capability of the government, but how the government is articulated at the national, regional, sub-regional level, matters more than, in many cases, the quantum of the resources that are available. There is a very interesting set of comparative cases that are emerging between the way in which South Korea and Germany, vis-a-vis countries like UK and US, have been responding to the crisis and coordinating multi-level governance in that respect, but also how, even within the same countries, there has been dramatic differences across regions. So this is an important issue in the context of thinking about the post-COVID, because of course, a response, the creation of new normal that builds up on the role of the state and industrial policy requires capabilities in the government to be implemented. In relation to these differences even across regions, some of you might remember that when the crisis erupted in Europe and Lombardia, the region in the north, and Veneto were among the most, the center of the epidemic at the very beginning in Europe, the two regions adopted a very different type of approach to the way in which they were managing the health system and found innovative solutions to the problems that they were facing in very different ways. And that was very much due to a number of differences in the way in which these regions and government capabilities have developed over time. There is a very interesting article in the Harvard Business Review that addresses exactly this issue. The third point that I think comes out very clearly is that pandemics and complex crises bring uncertainty, and uncertainty requires innovative solution to a radically transformed context. So the big question is, who can deliver this innovation? Who can deliver these responses given a high level of uncertainty and given the fact that the players involved might have different capability to do so. Now, I would like to go through a couple of cases and then mention a few studies and work that we've been doing with colleagues at United Nations Industrial Development Organization exactly in this area. Because I think we already start seeing some potential good answers to what we have posed as a fundamental question, which is how do we generate innovative responses, where the innovation comes from in the health system when we have a pandemic of this sort. And I will use two cases from one from the UK, actually, where UCL engineering department was central in delivering an important technology device, which was a continuous positive airway pressure, the CPAP. And also, I will look at the response that was given in Italy in the context of production of ventilators and protective equipment like masks. I will do that because I think both examples show how beyond several ideological opposition to industrial policy, in both cases, there are excellent examples of how government can steer, give directionality, give the ecosystem of players an organization, a direction, and can achieve very important results in relatively speed time. Now, the first case is about, as many of you might have followed, when the pandemic erupted, there was a fundamental global shortage of ventilators, but some countries had retained domestically capability in producing ventilators. Some others have lost these capabilities, and they lost them because ventilators are complex products which require lots of capabilities, manufacturing capabilities in subsystems. So when countries asked companies to scale up the production and ramp up the production of some of these technologies, the supply chain was not ready to respond to and adjust to that. In the context of the UK, there was an interesting example of how public institutions, in response to a call from the government, were able to identify a solution. In this case, was a consortium that started combining UCL engineers, but also engineers which were partially working in the past in the automotive industry, in particular Formula One, and in some of these engineers, but also some of the clinicians from the UCL health system and in general the NHS, is allowed to, in a very short time, and you will see some of the data in 1 second, to develop actually a response to the shortage of ventilators that were in high demand. And this was done by reverse engineering a solution that was already being proven and tested in both China and Italy, where 50-60% of patients were prevented from invasive mechanical ventilation by using this continuous positive airway pressure device. Now, the results are quite remarkable because the reverse engineering, ramping up, testing, authorization of this new device took record time. And these are the numbers that were presented recently in a government report, which was basically highlighting the best cases around the UK. And the lessons that we can learn, by the way, these technologies being developed as an open source technology. At the moment, there is a program that diffuses these technologies across a number of countries. And I think this is also an important aspect of this experience, which is really something that involved a number of key actors in the private sector, business enterprises, but was led by the public institutions with a public purpose in mind. What lessons we have learned from this first case? Well, first of all, that multiple actors were needed, and the rapid alignment of these actors was central. Now, if you have a country which has lost capacity in one of these areas, which means has disinvested in the health system or has gone through a dramatic deindustrialization, so has lost significant capabilities in key sectors and segments of the value chain, this alignment is not possible. So this is an important first lesson. The second is that it was not just an health innovation, it was actually an innovation in the design, device, and so required manufacturing capabilities. So this was not possible, it would have not been possible without this manufacturing capability being closely aligned with and retained in the country over years. Also, there was an important role that an institution like UCL, and in particular the engineering department working on health engineering, was playing, which was an interfacing intermediation role. And we know how intermediate institutions are critical in managing innovation processes, exactly because they are able to manage complex relationship and the interface between, for example, engineers, regulatory body, hospitals, and other players that were required, clinicians that were required to deliver this result. Now, in all this experience, the main role that was played was started by the government, was implemented by public institutions, and was leveraging an ecosystem of relationships that were existing around these institutions. In a similar way, in a similar fashion, the Italian response to the crisis in terms of health innovation and devices came from a very specific region, which I've been working on for 10 years now, which is the Emilia-Romagna region. For those of you who are of course, passionate about fast cars and so on, know that is where Modena is, where the Ferrari is, where the Maserati, the Lamborghini are, and so on. Less well known is the fact that this region has developed over the years a very complex ecosystem that make it one of the leaders in Europe in production of medical devices, and in particular hemodialysis machine, where in fact the only company which was still capable to produce ventilators was positioned in the country. At the same time, it was also the region which provided a response to a more humble technology, if you want, the masks, but a technology that required, actually, from the process and ramping up point of view, quite sophisticated solutions. So on the left of my slide, you see there are a couple of pictures of the Ciare, which was the company which was capable to produce ventilators, the only company left. And immediately after, below that, you see there was a second ventilator which has an innovation introduced by the Sant'Orsola Hospital in Bologna, which was actually using the same ventilators for 2 patients by basically creating, reverse engineering the technologies and creating this double ventilating system. On the other side, you see there is an example of a machine, an automated machinery piece that is able to produce up to 400 masks per minute, and which was basically developed by a company which was never active in this space, but was able to leverage its capabilities in this area. Again, why these companies managed to be responsive to this crisis? Let's start with the company which was actually scaling up and ramping up the production of masks. What is interesting is that this is a company I've been working on before the crisis for many years. It's a company which is a global leader in packaging machinery, in automation, but is a company which managed to develop its capabilities and be ready to respond to the government call in these years, partially because can leverage the existence of very well-structured regional industrial policy. On the bottom, maybe you cannot read, it's too small, but there is a list of all the technology, intermediate and technology research centers spread across the regions in many of the technology areas, domains that are critical for packaging, automation, materials, advanced materials, but also because the same company operated in a responsible way over the years. After the financial crisis, this company wanted to reassure its supply chain by actually creating forms of co-ownership and forms of supply chain arrangement, which actually relieved part of the pressure that the supply chain had and allowed to keep lots of the companies able to keep producing and keep being innovative and productive over the years. So in other terms, it's a complex ecosystem where a company which played a role in nurturing the supply chain, a government which played a role in constantly adapting its supply of technology, health, infrastructure and solutions, combined and aligned together and were made possible in a moment of crisis to, in fact, bring in the solution that was needed. The story of the medical device is very similar. The medical device, which is now counting around 130 companies operating in a small town close to Modena and producing, as I said, leading technologies in the same region, small town, you can find companies like Ambro, B. Brown, Baxter, Fresenius, so international leader in this area. These companies were attracted by a cluster of activities, which again started with some initial industrial policies from the 60s and 70s and some entrepreneurial activities which moved from producing capacity in basically tubing, plastics, so leveraging the capability in plastic and injection molding technologies to move towards more and more sophisticated machinery, including hemodialysis machinery and the ventilators. Now, here again, this capacity was there, but the government had to play a key role in bringing in both the military partially and companies in the automotive sector, which could actually scale up the capacity of these relatively smaller companies in the supply chain to produce these technologies. Again, an ecosystem that is reacting and leveraging a very complex set of cross-cutting technologies. I'm mentioning this because people don't realize that, in fact, behind some of these health innovations, we are actually leveraging the key technology platform of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We are talking about advanced material, we are talking about sensors, we are talking about data, we are talking about complex integrated systems. And in fact, when we have done work across a number of these companies, we managed to track down which were these distinctive capability domains and what was the way in which they were deployed across sectors. Now, the reason why I'm raising this case is because medical technologies and in general the health sector, the health industry, can provide a key multiplier effect, can become a central player in the restructuring of economic systems where a number of industrial and service activities and gone into crisis. And can do that exactly because, as the example I just showed you, many of the technologies and the health innovation require a fundamental engagement with path-breaking and new technologies, and also allow to integrate different type of experiences. Now, for countries who are entering, the countries I described, like UK and Italy, well, UK had a dramatic deindustrialization, which has still affected until today, still affects the capacity of the country in terms of its tradable sector and so on. And on the other side, Italy is still a country which has retained quite significant manufacturing capabilities across a number of industries, but where also the industrialization after the financial crisis was very dramatic. So the importance of thinking about health is, the health industry is something that it's central for this type of economies, as much as for countries which are trying to enter into a number of industrial sector and technology innovations. Now, the case of Costa Rica is always mentioned as a good case of how a country managed to leverage the multiplier effect that the health sector, and in particular similar technology to the one I was showing before, starting from plastics, injection molding, and some of the digital technologies associated with other health solutions, were actually used in order to spur industrial transformation, structural transformation. The report that you see on the side is something we have just recently produced with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which was very much looking to a number of further cases where these opportunities can exist. Now, many of the industrial policy discussion of the past have always been trying to identify one of those sectors which could have a multiplier effect. The emphasis and the interest in developing the automotive industry has always been associated with the idea of an industry which has a dramatic multiplier effect in terms of technological linkages, spillovers, and so on and so forth. Well, my argument here would be that actually, in a post-COVID phase, we could actually start thinking more and more about the health industry and the complex interface between health industry, pharma, and all the public sector as a key driver of new type of economic growth. In order to do that, the problem is, as the example I showed, is to go back and rediscover what is the role of the state. So the state not simply as a player that is actually intervening as a guarantor of last resort, or someone that intervenes where the crisis is in place and there is some need for socializing the losses, but in fact rediscovering the state as the investor of first resort in shaping an healthy, resilient, and productive economy. And here again is very much a change in perspective from a industrial policy simply as a way of addressing market failure to an industrial policy where we think about the state as a market shaper, but also as a shaper of innovation, the direction that innovation can take. Of course, as I said in the very beginning, now the state needs to think about industrial policy, focusing on potentially sectors which can generate this dramatic multiplier effect, like the health industry can do, but at the same time can do that in a space where potentially the competition and the global trade patterns are fundamentally changing. So in other terms, if it is the case that global trade will not go back to the global trade patterns that we were observing up to a few years ago, and we are moving towards shorter supply chains and more interconnected regional markets, this can open new opportunities for developing supply chains around both pharma and medical devices that actually are closely linked and intertwined with the productive sector development in each of these countries. And the good news is that when we look at some of the, for example, medical device companies I was referring to, and the ecosystem and specific experience I was mentioning, there is space in some of these specific technological innovation for a full articulation of small, medium, and large enterprises. In fact, the key core of some of the technologies I showed you before in the Emilia-Romagna context are not produced by the major system integrators like the Baxter or the Fresenius and so on, but are integrated as a result of suppliers who are actually innovators and capable to be part of that value creation process. Now, why then we need the state to be involved in driving and capturing the opportunities that health industry and the restructuring of the health industry will require? Well, there are a few arguments. There are some arguments which are, if you want, well known in the industrial development, industrial policy literature. First of all, the fact that the state has an advantage in committing resources under uncertainty and is capable to internalize the dynamic efficiency that results from committing resources under uncertainty, in particular when there is such systemic uncertainty as the one we are facing now. Can give directionality to the economy, which means can provide both a direction and a vision that allows different economic activities to coordinate, but also can design and develop models of business models and governance models that are not left to practices like the one we are observing in particular in the pharma industry, in which instead of retaining and reinvesting resources generated, we have observed dramatic amount of financialization in place. I don't have time to go into it. I'm very happy to discuss more this point. We've been conducting research over the last 2 years looking at financialization in the pharma industry and comparing the experience of the UK with the experience in the US with a team involving Professor William Lazonik, who's been leading this research in the US. And what is striking is to find leading companies who are now very important and central in the response also to the vaccine issue to be constantly challenged internally in their governance structure and their business model by these continuous tensions between financialization and innovation, where companies who have been going beyond the patent cliff, where their sales are reducing dramatically, where their pipeline of drugs is still not redeveloping, and despite all this, still companies where the amount of cash out in terms of dividends and stock buybacks is absolutely dramatic. Seeing this tension, this distortion in the system is another good reason to actually rethink the extent to which such a key industry should be left or unregulated in a context of high financialization. There is a third point why the role of the state is so important, and here I will like you to the University of Johannesburg, which in fact we were presenting recently at the Istituto di Economia at the University Federal de Rio de Janeiro. And this is about the role of the state in targeting financial resources in a more strategic way. And in particular, targeting financial resources to be able to go beyond what we call the middle income technology trap. In the past, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on, are facing a triple challenge, which is breaking into the global economy, so being able to position themselves into the global economy with significant shares, interventions, linking up, but at the same time linking back into the local production system. And thirdly, they have a fundamental challenge in keeping pace with technological change and innovation, especially in a space where digitalization, digital platform, and data pose completely new challenges to industrial policies. Now, in this specific context, the post-pandemic offer partially opportunities to rebuild a system can be anchored to the local economies, can be fundamentally shaped by the way in which the government design, regulate, and develop this industry. There is relatively more space, policy space globally in terms of shaping and applying industrial policy in this area. There is a very interesting piece by the South Center from Geneva looking at exemptions in TRIPS, the trade, the treaties on international countries can have and can leverage more policy space in these areas. So in other terms, now we are in a space where the middle income technology trap, which is this combination of challenges, can be addressed by using the health industry and the health sector as a new way of transforming the economy. But of course, the trap is technological to the extent that it's difficult for countries to actually transform the way of looking at different stages of technological development, the TRL, technological readiness levels. And what we have been seeing increasingly in industrial policy discussion is that people realize that there is the so-called valley of debt, that there is an area where technological innovation is underfunded and requires targeted support, which could be either support through finance or support through specific technology services, like the one that institutions like Fraunhofer in Germany, A3E3, the same in Bravo, Fiocruz and others can play and perform in the sector. And this is particularly important for middle-income countries because their valley of debt, so the lack of funding that exists between the basic research and the funding required for commercialization and development of the technology is particularly deep. And that's what that difference between the red and the blue lines suggests. And in fact, we have compared different models and approaches of industrial policy that can be used to actually reduce this valley of debt and increase the capacity of countries to keep pace with technological change. Now, what is interesting, and I will, I'm running short of time, so I will try to close here and leave space for the discussion, and we can go back to some of these issues later on. What seems to me critical here is that in filling this middle-income technology trap and in trying to use the health industry as a new driver or multiplier effect across the economy, there is need for the government being able to use its full spectrum of industrial policy tools. And I would like to mention two here that are particularly important, I think. Procurement, of course, is a key and appropriate tool to shape health innovation. And the state can use it to not only to create demand, but also to experiment, nurture ecosystem, impose conditionalities on the way in which firms or the same public sector operate in this area. And this can result, of course, in not just innovation and technologies, but also in high quality employment. There is also another area which I think is particularly important, which is the building up of those set of institutions, intermediate institutions that are central to align the operations, as in the case I showed before in the case of UK and Italy, across different players when is required to address new challenges, uncertainties, and new innovation. And here, I think for especially middle-income countries, it's particularly important to consider these technology intermediaries because they are fundamentally based on the idea that we are not simply providing market incentives, but in fact, we are providing public services that can be leveraged by companies who are keen to be innovative and transform their activities to actually become more competitive and, more importantly, more innovative in key areas of innovation. Of course, technology intermediaries like the one I was mentioning before, if we think about the classical example, the Fraunhofers in Germany, or again, other experiences across the Global South, are institutions that fundamentally require a strong state, a state that is capable to provide the type of, not just funding, but the type of directionality to this institution and back up their operation in the relationship with the private sector. So this opens a new way of thinking about the way in which public-private relationships are built beyond a more simplistic way of talking about public-private partnership, and opens the door to actually new articulation of the state and institutional building in the area of technological development and health innovation in particular. So I will stop here because I think I run out of my time, and I again thank for the opportunity to have this conversation with you, and I look forward for questions and discussion. Thanks, Claudia.
Many thanks, Professor Andreoni. Many thanks for this thought-provoking analysis, bring useful elements, questions, and lessons that can coordinate with the analysis of Brazil's challenges and responses. So, at this moment, I would like to invite Professor Carlos Gadelha to make his comment. Carlos Gadelha holds a PhD in economics from the Economics Institute of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Carlos is the coordinator of prospecting activities of the presidents of Fiocruz. He also teaches and supervises master and PhD theses at the National School of Public Health. He has a vast scientific production and coordinates the research group on development, economic industrial complex, and innovation in health. Carlos was vice president of production and innovation in health at Fiocruz. He was the secretary of science and technology and strategic products at the Ministry of Health, and also secretary of industrial development and competitiveness at the Ministry of Industry, Development, and Foreign Trade. I also would like to encourage the audience to send questions, to make interventions, and using the chat function here. Also, you can introduce yourself, putting the name and the institution. Carlos, over to you.
First of all, I'd like to thank very much the CDTS and IIPP, Morel, Claudia, Marco Tulio, and now Antonio Andreoni. We form a network that we are very worried about how to face this crisis in a better way than we are seeing. It's a little difficult to comment because I agree with everything, but at the same time, it's part of our discussion to try to develop the perspective in concrete terms and to discuss some aspects. I'd like to analyze first, the diagnostic is very, very good. The crisis is not a conjunctural or how can I say, a specific crisis nobody knows. No, it's a structural crisis. We have to remember that in the past we have SARS, MERS, H1N1, Ebola, and so on. Then it reveals the structural problems of the capitalism dynamic and geopolitical crisis. It is very clear, and I agree completely. And but it is a very, very strong challenge because you have to think about how to face it in a structural form. It's not only a small measure to deal with that or to wait for the next pandemic, to wait for the next inequality, wait for the next shortage of product, wait for what? We can't wait. There will not be a new normal, very good, very nice, remote interaction, but you have to face it very strongly. Then I agree completely, and you have to move forward in this perspective. And the second point, I have to confess you, this point I was not prepared to talk to you. I prepared other points, but I got very stimulated with the speech, and I decided to bring that. I'm controlling my time, okay? The second one is the different across countries. Really, the problems to see the robustness, resilience, and readiness is very, very good to think in these terms. And the health is clearly a way to face all of these. To maintain activities, nowadays you must invest, you must spend in the health care to maintain life. You must preserve our production system, and at the same time health, I suppose, and I'm studying that for a long time, it's a key system for the new pattern of technological development. And then health at the same time permit us to face this triple challenge that was pointed by Antonio so precisely. The third point I'd like to say that we must consider, and it's related, life is not a problem. Okay, nowadays what people are saying, no, health is a problem, or the GNP, or life is not a problem. It's an unethical perspective to consider that life is a problem. We must preserve life. It is, we are economists to think about that. Economics is a moral science. It's not a technical science to adjust budgets, to scarce budget for the objectives or for the expenditure you need. Then, and thinking about this perspective, we must consider that health policy and the health universal system is part of the solution. It's part of the solution. It's not the other way of thinking. And I think that Antonio brought this perspective very clearly, giving some very good examples to think about health as a solution and life as an ethical commitment of everybody. It must be like that. I know that it's not, how can I say, many people don't think like that, but you have to emphasize that, the ethical perspective and the ethical commitment with life. But at the same time, health solution is a way to face this crisis. I have some specific questions, 3 specific questions to develop our interaction. I'm very excited to establish a close interaction in 2013. The Mariana Mazzucato group visited the health ministry when we are trying to change, to establish a game changer. The health ministry coordinates the industrial policy. It was completely new in the world that a social ministry was coordinating the industrial and innovation policy for a specific sector. And I think that this perspective, we must reinforce, even thinking about the global perspective. I've read recently some papers of Gabriel Palma, and he talked about the reverse catching up. The problem is that the developed countries are following a path that increase inequality, increase social exclusion, increase, reduce innovation for people, and they have industrial problem. UK is a very clear problem, a very clear example. United States also. Then the problem, Antonio analyzed, I'm a little worried because it's a global problem. It's not anymore a problem of underdeveloped world. And how to match the science and technology and innovation with the social needs, with the people needs, and with the environment needs. This is a global question, and at the same time, the national state has a key role. Then I want to discuss a little, to emphasize that I like the perception of health innovation ecosystem, but the national innovation system is central, because the national power in the national state is the arena where democracy is established to link the social needs, to link the science, technology, and the industry with the social needs. And how to interact. We must act globally, but at the same time, the national space are very strong. That's why Antonio showed us the different answer of UK, United States, and Brazil. The national states are very, very important. The national government are very important. How to deal with this question? How to interact the national, local policy with a global perspective? Because nowadays, how can I say, liberalism is over. Is over. Everybody's fighting. More than 100 countries are establishing barriers for health exportation products. You can see that in a naive way. Liberalism, unfortunately, maybe, is over. Then we have how to deal with that, and at the same time to have a global perspective for a more, how can I say, for a better world. The second question, how to think about innovation considering the system and not a specific sector. I agree completely. Sometimes the product must have the name, ventilator, vaccine, but at the same time, for example, in COVID battle, how innovate in primary care? It is absolutely central. How to introduce AI in primary care? How to introduce big data in primary care? Maybe it is much more important than ventilator. Then the systemic perspective must, how can I say, be considered all the time, even to invest in one product, as vaccine, ventilator, and so on. And nowadays I'm completely dedicated for the vaccine. We need that, okay? But at the same time, we must not consider it as a magic bullet, okay? Because the system must be evolved. The national system must be evolved. The universal health national system must be reinforced. And the final, it's not exactly a question. It's a way to change ideas and to develop together. The final question is, I'm very worried about the real opportunities, because at the same time, many people are talking about industrial policy, how to rethink about the global value chain in a more regional perspective. When you see more close, in Latin America, there is not more a convergence of policy, of interaction, and so on. When you see Europe, Brazil, and so on, when you see the battle between USA and China, and how can I say? I think that we must return, unfortunately, for the political battle, how to establish priority, how to select our politician, the politics, the national politics, even to establish global cooperation direct by solidarity is completely essential. Then the solution is not, how can I say, I confess I'm not pessimist. Okay, I'm not pessimist, but I have to face that the indicators, the real indicators I have, is not very good for the solution. How to suppress this context that is very, very unfavorable. Inequality is getting worse. The patent in health and 10 countries domain or get more than around 90% of health patents. Only in 10 countries. 16 companies respond for 60 patents in the health field. Then what I'm seeing that asymmetries are increasing, inequality are increasing, mercantilist battle are increasing. But I don't want to be negative, but it's only to analyze that we must act politically to change these things, because the natural way is not good. We must consider how to get a social base for real change. And the health perspective Antonio presented us is a very good example, how to connect with society. Society is not worried about specific medicine or specific. Society is worried about health, about quality of life, about expectation of life. If you can talk with society, maybe is a way to legitimate industrial policy, industrial science, technology, and innovation health policy. Health, only to finalize, we are making a study about social perception about science. Oswaldo Cruz Foundation occupied the first position. Why? Because population notice that we deal with health, not with specific research or with specific products that we did. All of people think about the new vaccine. But first of all, they notice Oswaldo Cruz Foundation has a strong commitment during the last 120 years with health, with the guarantee of life, and at the same time you generate innovation, employment, and so on. It's only a part of interaction, but I really congratulate Antonio, and I like really very much, and I'm anxious to continue this very nice interaction. And CDTS, how can I say, give us a present with this speech and with this opportunity. Thanks a lot, and these are my first words. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Carlos. Professor Andreoni, you have comments?
Well, first of all, thanks, Carlos. I think you raised a number of important issues. I don't want to take too much time because I would like to have more people involved in the conversation. I think there are a few remarks that I think are resonates particularly with what I was trying to articulate. One is really this issue of how do we understand the political economy of all this, right? It's not something I address directly, but industrial policy, it's not a technical exercise. It's a political economy exercise. It's really deciding how really the society as a whole is transformed. And in the context of innovation, it's really also about who is actually, creating the value and who is capturing this value, how the value is distributed, and what is the political economy of that. In the work we have done on the specific on what is happening in terms of financialization in the production of drugs, my main conclusion has been that actually we should start thinking about corporate governance reforms as an industrial policy. Because if you decide, if you're able to and actually it's at zero cost industrial policy, if you are able to shape certain type of corporate governance models that do not allow forms of redistribution of value that actually is being created exactly by the ecosystem I was referring to, and dramatic public investment in this area, especially in the early stages of scaling up of these technologies, then corporate governance reform becomes a way to make sure that the society benefit from what the state is able to coordinate in terms of innovation, in terms of investment, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the reflections in terms of some of these instruments are not technical instruments, are fundamentally addressing the political economy of, and if you want, the most fundamental social contract that is behind what we have been discussing. In terms of I appreciate your emphasis on the national aspect of the innovation system and so on. I would like to respond to that, saying that it's interesting how we constantly talk about, what is the most effective level of governance for implementing industrial policy. And I think the more we see the emergence of specific ecosystem around countries, the more we sometimes question the extent to which the national level is able to capture some of these dynamics. I'll give you an example. If in Europe today you want to address some specific cluster of activities or new technologies, in many respects, it's not a national issue because the ecosystem are so much integrated across nations that it's difficult to identify what is the government to understand better what is needed and target intervention in that intersections. For other areas, the national government is still central because it's able to shape, in the case of the national health system, procurement, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is, it's really critical to come out with a more refined understanding of where we need to have more regional or cross-regional or different level of governance to be effective in industrial policy, and where actually the traditional national state can do that. Certainly what we see in the UK constantly being involved in several conversations, governments and other regional institutions, is that countries who have been centralizing some of these activities and not retaining capacity spread across their different places and their different regions and so on, they find very difficult to give a targeted intervention. At the end of the story, industrialization is a process that tends to create dualism. So policies are about managing that, right? But avoiding that dualism in terms of certain areas getting more developed than others doesn't result in actually the type of structural imbalances we don't want to see happening. But there is a natural dynamic that pushes towards concentration. I mean, I just mentioned a few cases, but if you think about medical device clusters across all the most developed nations, they're all clustered in very few areas and regions. And if we want to open up the opportunities that health innovation and health industry offer, we really need to think how to actually spread much more that opportunity and reconnect some of these dynamics of supply innovation with the locality, with the place in which they are generated. I'll stop there, but again, there were lots of interesting points you raised that I also share. So I would just repeat what you said. So I refrain myself from doing that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, you both, for these exciting and interesting comments. I think now we could move to the part of questions and comments from the audience. So we have a couple of questions now. I think I can read two questions and you answer. It's okay, Andreoni? Okay. Oh, I have a question. The first question. A robust multilateral system has been crucial to overcome global challenges, to delivering for most vulnerable populations amid many health crises. As an example, the coordination of diverse interests in the negotiation of World Trade Organization agreements was vital for the creation of the TRIPS flexibilities, which impacted health innovation systems in developing countries. Nowadays, at the international level, we see increasing commercial and geopolitical tensions and a multilateral system under intense stress. So, how do you evaluate this international scenario? Is this an excuse for more isolationism? Or there is confidence that a new and better and more inclusive international order will emerge? Will the desired sustainable future be affected by the structure of multilateral arrangements? I think there is a question somehow related to my question that was made by Fabiana Basile. She says, "Thank you both for your great presentation. My question is, can intellectual property rights be a barrier to the catch-up process of developing countries through health industries? If so, are there insights on how developing countries could overcome this obstacle?"
Okay, these are excellent and challenging questions. Let me try to start with this issue of multilateralism. In the industrial policy discussion for many years, there has been a big discussion around, what is the policy space that countries have to implement industrial policy, and the extent to which actually multilateral arrangement were problematic, right, in terms of including intellectual property rights and so on, in terms of operating in the policy space and using policy interventions that traditional tools of industrial policy. What we have been seeing is that, paradoxically, that multilateral arrangement was working better than the type of configuration that we are seeing now emerging, which are much more on bilateral terms or in a regional context. So lots of the bilateral arrangements that countries are signing tend to have much more stringent requirements in terms of what is doable in terms of industrial policy, and they're much more invasive. In fact, we wrote a piece for a volume that Joe Stiglitz and others edited just last year on the new global rules and how the bilateralism that has been introduced into this space has made extremely difficult for some countries to implement real industrial policy. So I would say the lack of, or the extent to which multilateralism is in a retrenching is not if you want, something that we can see in good health and developing over the coming years. This is something that should be worrying. On the other hand, multilateralism itself, if we think about intellectual property rights, also had problems that had to be addressed, and the voice from the Global South was always in a difficult position. Now, the geopolitical situation is changing in such a way that the traditional categories which we use to understand multilateralism don't seem to work anymore. So we do quite a lot of work, for example, in looking at the way in which China is operating in a number of countries, in particular in the African, sub-Saharan African context. We've done some work looking at how the import penetration from China has developed over the years, and becoming the first partner. And this is not just in sub-Saharan Africa, of course. If I think about Chile, if I think about many Latin American countries as well, China has become the main trade partner. In this relationship, the problem is how the government retains capacity and is strategically capable to use the policy space that still exists to actually not end up in a situations where the fundamental, what our colleague before was mentioning about Gabriel Palma's sentence around, this reverse catching up. So avoiding that reverse catching up in place, a sort of situations where countries establish new relationship, and this new relationship in a bilateral context become even more stringent than multilateral arrangement. So that is my main concern, is to understand how we go beyond that bilateralism and towards different forms of multilateralism. And in this respect, intellectual property rights regime is, of course, one of those regimes that have been particularly problematic. I was involved in some of the discussion at UNDESA when we were signing up this document on the first SDG report, the Sustainable Development Goals report. And lots of the contestation was about what also was mentioned before, the fact that in terms of goals, we are talking about a number of important achievements that all countries seem to share, but at the same time, in terms of the technology that are required in order to make this transition in the environmental context and now in the health context, it's actually quite problematic when key technologies are controlled in a way that doesn't respond to a public purpose and a public interest. And the debate at the moment on the vaccine is particularly scary, if you want. You were referring in the beginning at that conversation, that piece between Mariana and Els Torrell. It's particularly problematic because it's quite an undemocratic process if you think about how it's unfolding. There are significant amount of resources that come from the public sector, which makes some of this research possible. And the value that potentially is created now is captured by a number of companies who are not even guaranteeing if they are going to sell and to provide at a certain type of prices the vaccine to the countries where they are based and so on. So that is a quite challenging aspect that requires really a fundamental rethinking of multilateralism, because of course, especially after the position that also the US has taken in the case of the WHO and the way in which these institutions have been challenged, clearly there is need to rethink how multilateralism works. And the UN probably has shown a number of itself challenges in terms of playing the role that we expect from that type of multilateral organization to play. And in fact, with Alicia Barcena and some colleagues from UNCTAD, we were having a conversation about that a couple of months ago, trying to unpack what the UN multilateral system is doing in response to the crisis and where the limitations are.
Many thanks. We have more questions here. Meanwhile, if you want to send questions, use the chat box, or alternatively, you can also turn on your camera and make an oral intervention. I have two questions from Marco Túlio. The first one, Brazil faces a profound dependence on imported products in the health sector. Our internal capacity to produce active pharmaceutical ingredients, for example, is relatively low. What are the most appropriate strategies and public policies to address this issue and reduce this dependency? Second question, artificial intelligence will play a central role in the health sector in the coming years. Some data shows that few countries concentrate the technological capacity to develop artificial intelligence solutions. What strategies and public policies can be implemented by developing countries to leverage their capacity in emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence?
Right, so these are again very important topics. Let me start from the second one. It's interesting how this engagement with the digitalization, the new fourth industrial revolution, has developed across a number of countries. We were involved with the South African government, a international team of scholars and policymakers to try to design a digital industrial policy white paper for the country. And we spent quite a lot of time going around the country trying to understand what companies are doing, what were the capabilities in the digital space, and of course, artificial intelligence, data, and of course, also issues with data ownership and how the regulatory environment was or not up to speed with the changes in the platform technologies. Now, in this, what comes out quite clearly from that experience, and I think there is a some literature and some more evidence that is coming out from middle-income countries, is that the artificial intelligence, as much as lots of the digital technologies, are for sure going to be transformative, but this is still a revolution in the making, in the sense that there is some element of an hype in terms of how much spread these technologies are. There is, even in developed countries, in most advanced countries, the use of these technologies, which will be disruptive, which will have a dramatic impact in the way in which we organize production, in the way we use data, in the way in which data create or allow to capture value. All this is still in a stage where we cannot simply pretend that companies are ready to leapfrog into these areas. And in fact, there is need to think carefully about what are those foundational capabilities that are needed in order to benefit from these technologies. And here there is quite a lot of new work that is emerging on, for example, how to retrofit production system in order to benefit from the opportunities that digital technologies, the sensorization of technology, Internet of Things, and the algorithm to process this data will have. How to engage with this issue? Well, there are, first of all, this issue of how do you use industrial policy to speed up the and create those foundational capabilities. I know colleagues at the Istituto di Economia have done an excellent work led by the late David Kapfer, Giancarlo Ferraz, and others on looking at so-called Industria 2027 on what is the state of development of these technologies in the country, what are the pathways that can be used to move towards a more productive engagement with these technologies, and so on and so forth. What strikes me is that in all this work, there is not simply need for industrial policy, but there is also need for other set of policies that engage with the fundamental changes in the nature of the economy. So we are moving from a situations where factories were the center of the productive system to a situations where digital platform and data become critical in actually shaping the economy. And the traditional industrial policy alone might not be sufficient in an area where you tend to have natural monopolies and almost infinite rents emerging as a result of the existence of network effects and data. And so here, I think one of the issues that come to my mind as an important issue to work on is to see how we can integrate more and more industrial and competition policy to make developing countries and emerging economies able to benefit from the areas in which this new technology, like artificial intelligence, digital platform, and so on, offer, while at the same time reducing the risk of high level of concentration that would actually make quite difficult to enter, to break into this area. In fact, with some colleagues like Simon Roberts, we've just written a piece on integrating competition policy, looking at experiences in South Africa in the context of the different type of digital platform, including the health services. The other part of the story is a more value chain and industrial development traditional problem. So the fact that fundamentally we are in a global economy where, as a result of the vertical disintegration of many productive activities and their spread across different countries, a number of countries have managed to retain segments of the value chain while being disintegrated vertically, while others have lost big chunk backward in the industry, like the chemical industry, or down the stream of activities. And so the problem here is, how do we think about this issue, not simply as a problem of not controlling a certain segment of the value chain, but what are the implications of not having collocated in the country different segments of that value chain? So in this case, the capacity to produce certain type of key ingredients for the pharma industry, inputs for, as I was showing before, a medical device and so on. And here I think the main argument is an argument around not so much I want to retain everything to be independent, but the problem is how much I need to be co-located in my economy with these activities in order to be innovative. And exactly because, as we were discussing before, many of these innovations are cross-sectorial, operate at the interfaces between sectors. The strongest argument to rebuild capacity along the value chain domestically is actually to be able to be innovative in the future. And this is something that came out very strongly. There's a very interesting MIT study called Production in the Innovation Economy, where colleagues from the MIT, like Susan Berger, Tim Sturgeons, and others, were looking at what happened in the US when they lost capabilities in key part of their supply chain and in key industries, and the extent to which that has affected their innovativeness capacity. And their argument was, if this was a study from 2013, if in the past, they were referring to the early 2000, companies were locating their activities in China in order to have a cost advantage. Now, actually, they are locating there because they had an ecosystem advantage, an advantage exactly of having collocated all these different segments of the value chain. So my point is, really, we should think about this issue from an innovation capability perspective, not simply as a protectionist perspective or an approach that looks at closing value chains. The problem is what segment of the value chains we need to retain in order to be innovative. And if these segments are so important, then there has to be some element of directionality from the state in order to retain that key segment of the ecosystem.
Very good. Two additional comments, questions. One from André Lobato. He is a PhD candidate from the Public Policies and Development Program. Dear Professor Andreoni, hope you are all well in University of London. I am a proud alumnus. He asks, how does mission-oriented planning differs from traditional planning, as in China? We have a second question from Bruna Fonseca from Fiocruz. COVID-19 has made science increasingly more collaborative. Do you think that the way forward for achieving health innovation is through partnerships and collaboration? How can developing countries make the most out of these partnerships, considering their lower financial or productive capacity?
Thanks to both for this interesting question. Well, the first one, it's an interesting one, right? Because there has been so much interest in mission-oriented innovation, and of course, Mariana Mazzucato and others have been at the center of this discussion on how to think about missions in IPP. We have a mission-oriented innovation network is joining the network to be part of this community. Already Benedes is part of that. I think what mission orientation does is to, vis-a-vis a traditional planning approach, is to start from identifying specific type of needs or specific type of opportunities and constructing a solution around that is actually, if you want, demand-driven or needs-driven or mission-driven more than driven by a certain way of planning an organization, a set of organization interdependencies into the economy. And in doing that, it's probably an approach, the mission-oriented approach, which allows to introduce some element of, if you want, open system invariance in terms of how you approach the problem. So each countries and each context might approach a mission-oriented strategy in different ways, depending also on what they can leverage of their own specific context and what are the needs that are expressed by that context. So it's not a fits-for-all type of approach. It's not an approach that just provide a template for a supply side design, but actually it's a template that allows to think through what needs exist, where the opportunities are, and how to complement and to match these with the existing capabilities, the existing specificities that different contexts present, and at the same time understanding, creating the demand for the capabilities that are missing in that context. So understanding what are those elements that will be part of that mission. And I think what also does is to deliver something that is not necessarily pre-planned. So in a sense, in a mission-oriented approach, it's not simply achieving the mission, the goal. It's actually the journey through which you get to that point that matters, because there is an element of serendipity, if you want. There are lots of other things that you are able to develop, especially in the technology context, vis-a-vis situations where you are simply trying to deliver a certain type of planned economy or approach. So there is a much more open system in place. There is much more divergence pathways that are opened. In fact, the example I showed you before are examples of ecosystems where companies which were in, which had a certain type of capability in a sector moved towards other sectors and redeployed their capacities over time. And that was a key driver of that innovation. But at the same time, what was innovative was the capacity of the state, and in some cases even the regional governments, to create that demand, create that space, create that market that allowed then all the ecosystem to articulate around it. The second question is partially related to that, because it's really about how we think about collaborations and a partnership in this space. So I think after many years in which there has been a sort of retreat of the public sector in this area, I think there is a fundamental need to actually re-emphasize the public purpose nature of this sector, and the fact that this is a sector where the state and the state in all its articulation, the government, the public institutions are absolutely central, and they can take the lead in innovation. There are plenty of examples that show that actually a business model in a traditional sense is not better performing in terms of innovation in this, especially in the art sector. And the partnership, what is critical about the partnership is the extent to which we are able to understand clearly who are the actors that create value, and what are the actors that actually end up capturing that value. So in other terms, in all innovation processes, innovation is a collective process. In particular, in the health sector, we cannot afford that collective dimension is lost, and that the value that is generated as a result of the research, as a result of these supply chains and so on, is actually captured by few companies, which then are controlled and eventually highly financialized, and so are instruments to extract value from the society. So that's, I think, the key issue, is to think about partnership having an open relationship or an open, clear mandate around how to shape risks, rewards, value creation processes, value distribution processes, more than simply taking them as an ex post market failure problem to address once the issue has been in place. And I think economists find difficult to understand that, because they tend to operate within a market economy paradigm more than an organizational economy paradigm, where you actually think about configurations of ecosystems and different players and their role in the value creation process.
Okay, many thanks. We are coming to the end. We still have 2 last questions, and then I will close the question session. First of is made by Carla Montenegro from Fiocruz. University, industry, government relationships are strategic to promote innovation dynamics. Recently, society and environmental issues were added to this analysis, being seen also as strategic elements and relevant to the health field. What's your opinion? The second question, from Galba Freire. Excellent exposure of reality and new ideas. In the Brazilian public health system, we have a similar dilemma to the NHS that seeks to optimize resources to guarantee a public budget for the health or its citizens. What is the role of innovation in the health ecosystem to promote the optimization of the government health budget?
Again, excellent questions. I mean, the first one, I think, more than a question, it's really reinforced what I what I've been saying in my presentation, which is the fact that there has been an underestimation of the role that key technology intermediaries play in the process of innovation. If we think about many of the rich ecosystems that I was referring to before, these are ecosystems where we do not simply have good universities or universities that are engaged in some shape or form with the private sector and the companies, and they sort of develop technologies and so on. There are also key players who are operating at the interfaces. And I think this is something that has to be highlighted in the industrial policy discussion over and over again, because it has fundamental implication on how we design industrial policy. So, for example, if we think about what is required to do innovation, especially increasingly in complex areas like in the health innovation sector, there are lots of infra technologies, data systems, analytics, all sorts of beta factories, all infrastructures that are absolutely central to move from an innovation to from an invention to a new innovation, a new product systems. And providing this type of support becomes actually not simply a provision of service, but creating a platform that allows to build up and strengthen the ecosystem as a whole. Not just big companies able to support this type of complex processes, but in fact, small, medium enterprises being able to be part of that innovation process by relying on, if you want, quasi-public good technologies, as Link and others have called it. So there is a public good dimension in the infra technologies and the infrastructure that we are talking about at the center of this ecosystem that has been, in many cases, underfunded for many years. And as a result of that, the overall ecosystem has suffered. I mean, I was still working at Cambridge University a few years ago when in the UK, they reintroduced the so-called, they created a network called Catapults, which was a way of reinventing a sort of Fraunhofer system in the UK. The region I was referring to before, the example I was showing, is an institution which has been actually using technology intermediaries operating across universities, private sector, and other actors across the last 3-4 decades. So there is a fundamental approach that is important to understand in the context of industrial policy for innovation, that is not simply providing incentive, providing some market regulation that the market will develop the technologies or the companies will develop the technologies. It is really about creating this complex intersection of institutions and intermediaries. And my understanding is that Fiocruz is actually a very interesting example of an institution which operates across different segments of the value chain, from the production to the innovation to the research, and that actually is quite a phenomenal way of guaranteeing the type of innovativeness that I was referring to before. In the case of the NHS in the UK, or in general in the case of the national health system, when we talk about innovation, and coming to the second point, my reflection has been that it's not simply technological innovation. There's lots of organizational innovation that is required. And here the digital technologies can play a very important role in terms of making organizational structure more capable to respond to the evolving needs and to the the type of pressing needs, which can be the pandemic, it can be the aging society, can be different type of these issues. And I think on the organizational innovation side, it's one of those areas where we need to invest more as people interested on industrial policy making. So in other terms, there is the opportunity, as my colleague in IPP always talk about, to have innovative bureaucracies or innovative organization in the public sector that transform the game by innovating processes, innovating routines, innovating the way an organization is in contact with citizens, in contact with patients, and so on and so forth. And all that is something where we really need to realize that it's not, again, a technical issue, but is an organizational issue. And when we talk about organization, it's about institutional design, it's about understanding motivations, understanding incentive structures. So opening up the type of framework that we would use to simply implement an innovation model for the health sector. I'll stop there.
Many thanks. So we have come to the very end. I invite you and Carlos Gadelha to the last comments. And also Carlos Morel, he's online. I see him. You were also invited, our director.
Morel, good to see you. I don't know if Morel, do you want me to talk something now? I will do. First, thanks a lot for this opportunity. I'd like to emphasize only one key point for the discussion. How to overcome the valley of death. I think in this situation, our situation in Brazil and in emerging economy or underdeveloped economy is very different. We need not only brain, we need muscle. We need a production and technological system. Without this system, our knowledge will not create employment, investment, innovation in Brazil. Then the relationship between the production and technological system with the universal health system is absolutely essential to overcome the valley of death. We continue to fight in this direction. And the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation is a very good example. We are in the game of vaccine because we never left the game. We never left. The trajectory is very, very important. If you didn't produce vaccine, we will be out of the game to offer vaccine for our population. Then I think it's very, very important to think about how to build a strong, productive system in our country, in our, how can I say, competition. A more decentralized production is essential for the global universal access. The production must not be so concentrated in few countries and in few companies. The second, last commentary is that we must rethink the local content policy perspective. Nowadays, the local content that is crucial is knowledge. The data is the raw material of the 21st century. How to introduce, to develop knowledge, intelligence in the health system. It's absolutely crucial for our perspective. Then it's only these final comments to how can I say, we must return to the game. We must consider it's impossible to produce only soybeans and petroleum to participate of this global game and to introduce health products for our people and for thinking about for international cooperation. We must help, we must interact with Africa, with Latin America, but even to do that, we must produce, we must innovate, we must have access to knowledge. then it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited in this difficult context we are dealing, and I have to congratulate Morel, CDTS, Claudia, Marco Túlio, and Andreoni. It is a pleasure to know you, and I am anxious for the continuity of this interaction. Thanks a lot, and have a good day.
Well, I'd like now to give some words because it's already almost noon. I'm not going to be long. But, Carlos knows very well that speaking on the Valley of Death, I have always been speaking on the Valley of Death. In fact, CDTS was created to cross the Fiocruz Valley of Death and the Brazil Valley of Death. So for me, it was a big pleasure when Marco Túlio had the initiative to get approaching to this school and to Andreoni. And for us, coming from the biomedical sciences, we have always trying to involve more health economists, health policymakers. And when I see that CDTS is organizing a seminar of this level with such excellent economists like Antonio Andreoni, commented by Carlos Gadelha, I think CDTS is in the right direction. We are really not betting only on silver bullets from the biomedical areas, but we are betting on several silver bullets from different areas to help foster innovation in all areas. So thanks a lot to Túlio, thanks to Claudia, who has hosted this seminar, Carlos Gadelha, and of course, Professor Antonio Andreoni for his excellent exposure and participation. So CDTS is very happy to have hosted this meeting. Thanks.
Well, I'll just thank you for extremely generous words. And I also, as I was mentioning in the very beginning, we have started a conversation with Marco Túlio and other colleagues to actually strengthen collaboration and discussion in this direction. I hope this is going to be just the start of the continuation of the conversation. There are several other friends across Brazil we have been, as an institution, interacting with over the last years, and we really see an opportunity here to, especially bringing in the experience that Fiocruz has in dealing with issues like the value of debt, dealing with the importance of innovation, knowledge creation, production, to actually build up on that experience and other experiences to see how to respond to the new challenges that are emerging. And so for us, it's a great opportunity to co-develop with you new knowledge, new understanding, and hopefully having an impact on such important areas. So thanks again for the invitation, and I hope to be back in Brazil soon in the months, as soon as things will improve. Thanks a lot.
Okay, very good. Summing up, I would like to say a big thank you to the panelists for giving their time and expertise. This was an amazing and very helpful discussion. We have a research agenda to think about, and for the future, we have an opportunity to act in solidarity. Professor Andreoni, it was a real pleasure to have this chance to meet you virtually. I hope in the future we can invite you to Fiocruz. This debate created a chance to continue the dialogue between our institutions. Thanks to all that have joined this debate, I could see many people from the Institute of Economics, from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and also I think some colleagues from Campinas. And I would like also to thank all my colleagues from Fiocruz that organized the session. And I wish you a very good day and stay safe. And we are closing the session. Thank you.